Hi, everybody. We'll get started. Welcome to the Legends of High-End Audio panel. I'm Robert Harley, the editor of The Absolute Sound, and I'll be the moderator today. And about 3 years ago, we got the idea at The Absolute Sound to document the whole history of high-end audio in a series of large-format books. And in the course of working on those books, we interviewed a lot of the company founders of people who created the industry and found some really fascinating stories about how they got started in high-end audio and what their values were. So we had a renewed appreciation for the people who created this industry. And it's easy to come to a show like this and take for granted the fact that we can buy equipment that takes us that much closer to the musical experience, and that we don't just have available products that were designed as commodities like another household appliance. So we're really fortunate that there were pioneering individuals who created the industry whose products we enjoy so much. So we put together a panel of what we call legends of high-end audio, and these guys truly are legends. So I'd like to introduce each of them. At the far right is Dan D'Agostino, founder of Krell and D'Agostino Master Audio Systems. Next to him is Arnie Nudell, founder of Infinity Systems in 1968. Next to him is Paul McGowan, PS Audio. He's the P in PS Audio. Next to him is Richard Vandersteen, and Bob Stewart, founder of Meridian Audio. So I'd like to ask each of them a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from you. And my first question for each of the panelists is, tell us about how you began, how you decided to make a product and sell it. Not a kit product or just something for yourself, but saying, I can make a product and actually sell it and become part of the industry. So why don't we start with you, Dan?
Okay. I guess that came when I got guy I was working for went out of business, and around 1978 I was kind of looking around for something to do, and I went to the CES show, looked around at all the products there, and I like to always quote the motto of a guy with a concrete truck that I saw once, and said, "Find a hole and fill it." That's what I did. I looked around and I found a need for a big Class A amplifier. Everybody was talking about Class A amplifiers. Nobody actually made one. I mean, everybody said their amps were Class A, and you know, I kind of cobbled together some test equipment, went around to different stores and took a look at their so-called Class A amplifiers and measured them and found out that I was right. None of them are Class A. So I went back and I started tinkering around with the Class A amplifier. I kind of set my sights on 100 watts because in 1980 those were reasonable watts. You know, that was like pretty good size amplifier. So I started to design a 100-watt Class A amplifier. I found that it got really hot really fast. So I decided I was going to use fans, and cooling it was really an issue at first. But once I figured out how I was going to run the fans and how slow I was going to run them, how much heat sink I needed to sweep across, and how much temperature rise I was willing to take with the fan speed, I kind of figured that out. And then I built a hellaciously large power supply with two kilowatt transformers, one for each channel, and made the KSA 100, which is the first product I ever built at Krell. And that was designed in 1979, built probably the first working unit was built in November of 79, and there's 3 actual working units with the real metalwork on them that went to Las Vegas with me. So I drove across the country with my then partner Rondi, and we got to Las Vegas with 3 100-watt Class A amplifiers. And that's how we got started.
And you thought you might sell 50 in a year, and you came back from Las Vegas with orders for more than 50.
We built 3 amplifiers. We happened to have a machine shop next door to us with a guy that I think had some kind of dyslexia, because every drawing I gave him he made backwards. And but anyhow, at the end of the day, he finally got it right. And I had a sheet metal guy right across the street. So I was able to get 3 pieces built with a lot of effort, and paper bag drawings, because those are the best. And I got these 3 amplifiers done. We brought them to the show. The first guy that walks in, this guy from Germany, he orders 18 amplifiers. So I go, wow, okay. Get his name, no internet. And a few other people came in, sold a couple amplifiers to Switzerland. Japanese distributor Yaso Nakanishi, which many of you probably know, especially guys in this panel, came in and bought 10. I mean, it was one of those things where it just kept on building and building and building. And I looked at Randy and I said, well, I think we're in big trouble, because I have no idea how to build this many amplifiers. So we went back to Connecticut, and we went back to New York, because that's where we were living. Found a little space in Connecticut that was about 1,000 square feet on the bottom of the Allied Elevator Company, in what the police described as the busiest street in Connecticut, which meant that it was violent and nasty and something going on every night. But we're in the bottom of this old building, which used to make electric cars, by the way, and it was the Allied Elevator Building in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And we started figuring out how to build these things. And, we built, it was rough. We took in some talent from the neighborhood that would show up every other day, and, but we paid them in cash, so they always came back. But it was a real challenge to figure out how to build more than 1 or 2, and then make them all the same. So it was really it was an eye opener. You think it's really easy, because anyone can build one of anything. If you're an engineer, you can build one of everything, anything, and make it work. But then when you're all done with it and you want to hand it off and say, okay, you guys build it, then it's a whole different thing. So that was a real lesson in humility and in a real learning curve.
Well, from a very early age, I always had a great love of music, and kind of with that, a love of audio, as it was 1,000 years ago when I started playing with it. I kept building different audio systems over many years, and the last audio system that I really built, it wasn't really my own, was a 4/3 Klipschorn using a 15-inch woofer, a Janssen electrostatic, mid-range, and tweeter, and an ionic tweeter on top of that. So you can see, even in those days, I was really into audio. Fast forward a little bit, my real job was a laser physicist, and I was working at Litton Industries, and my group was making a laser rangefinder for the F-4D aircraft. Not loud enough, eh?
Someone back there is.
So that was my real job, and many of the kinds of electronics that were used for this laser rangefinder, which was coupled to the navigation system of the F-4D aircraft, use kinds of electronics like switching amplifiers, for example, and a variety of other things that you really couldn't find in your local electronics store. So I met a guy who was actually working for me, John Ulrich, a very talented electronics engineer. And he was into music, different kind of music, but he was into music just like I was. And we decided that that all of the audio systems that were out at that time, and this was the mid-'60s, mid to late 60s, we really thought didn't reproduce music in a way that, we thought it could be. And so he and I collaborated together to make what was finally called the Servostatic 1 speaker. And what we used is an 18-inch woofer, and we were one of the first people to use a real servo system on the woofer. So it had very uniform response, down to about 16 hertz. We used electrostatic panels for the mid-range, and we used electrostatic tweeters down the middle of this speaker, and we called it the Servostatic 1, and this was for our own amusement. Well, an audio store was not very far from where I lived, and we thought, well, now that it's all working, let's bring it into this audio store and see what this guy thinks. He sold a lot of high-end equipment. So we brought it in and played it for him, and he said, how many of these can you make? And I said, well, I have no idea. We just have one, and we made one, and it took a long time to make one. He says, no, I really want to know how many can you make. I said, well, first of all, this is a very expensive system. We priced it out. It was going to sell for about $2,000 retail if you would sell it. And that could buy a Volkswagen in those days. And he said, $2,000? I don't care. How many can you deliver? So he says, I can sell as many as you can make. And I said, well, I don't know how many we could make. And I gave him a number. And I think we delivered 5 to him with great effort, and we got some outside help, and we made 5 of these things. And as soon as we got it in the store, he called me the next day. He says, I need 10 more. And I'm like, how is this possible? I mean, nothing sold for that kind of money in those days. So he kept selling them at a very prodigious rate, and people seemed to like them and didn't care if they spent $2,000 on this speaker system. It was rather different, and it sounded rather different than most things that were out there, and that was 1968. So we formed a company called Infinity, and we started making the Servostatic 1, and even as the company Infinity grew, the Servostatic certainly sold like wildfire around the world. And then we decided to make a speaker that more people could afford. Since we were pretty successful with the $2,000 speaker, we made a speaker called the 2000A, and that had electrostatic strips down the side. It was a large bookshelf speaker. It had a transmission line bass system, and we sold a ton of those. And that's really how, between the Servostatic 1 and the 2000A, that's how Infinity started. And at one point, probably, I guess it was about 8 years or 9 years later, Infinity became the largest speaker company in the world. Next.
Well, move forward a couple of years.
A lot of years.
A lot of years. Well, 1973 is not that far away, is it? 68.
You're lousy in math.
I am lousy in math. I had just gotten out of the Army and was working as a disc jockey at several stations, which is a funny story in itself. And I was working on a musical synthesizer. In those days, you all heard of a Moog synthesizer, I'm sure. Robert Moog invented the synthesizer, amongst other people. And back then, synthesizers were what we called one-note wonders. So you could only hit one note at a time. It had a voltage-controlled keyboard. And I was intent on building the first polyphonic synthesizer. I figured, if we could make something where you could hit all 10 keys at the same time, you could play chords, play it like a piano. And so I started a company called Infinitizer, and we were hell-bent on leather trying to build this thing. It's actually sold the first one to Walter Carlos, who had made an album a long time ago called Switched on Bach. And he was very interested in it, and so he was our first customer. Never got to sell one to him, but he wanted it, and which is another long story, which we could bore everybody with forever. But The end of that synthesizer story was where I learned a term: you can't squeeze blood out of a turnip, after we had been taken to the cleaners from a subcontractor. But no one here would know about subcontractors, right, Don or Dan? Anyway, so during that time, I was working as a disc jockey and rather strapped for cash. And the station came to me and said, you know something about electronics. We need a whole new studio. Could you build part of it for us? And I said, sure, anything for money. So I designed a phono preamplifier, which was the first thing that we had started with, and built those for the station. And they sounded pretty good, and they paid me for it. And the original prototype was built into a Roytan cigar box and ran on 2 9-volt batteries. And what I wanted to wind up doing was taking that and seeing, well, you know, how did it sound? So one of our sponsors, the Ball Waterbed Company, was Norm Little. He was an audiophile and kind of well known around the city of Santa Maria as such. So I brought this little Roytan cigar box over to Norm's place, and I said, I want to hook this up to your big stereo. And he said, it doesn't even have a plug. So I said, yeah, I know, but it runs on batteries. And he goes, well, you're not hooking that up to my stereo. But I have this waterbed installer. His name's Stan Warren, and he is also into high-end audio, which I had never even heard the term. And so Stan and I met. I took the little cigar box over to Stan's house, little shack out in Orchid, and I walk into this guy's house, and he had a bouncy wooden floor and a Rabco turntable set up on poles that he had drilled holes through the wooden floor, mounted him into the dirt underneath his house. And so Stan was very much into all this stuff, had a Dynaco Pat 4 and I think he had a SA31B amplifier. Anyway, we hooked all this up. He played it, compared it to the Dynaco, and went back and forth and said, this is really quite amazing. So about 2 weeks later, I was at home working on the synthesizer, and a knock on my door, and he came over and he plunked $500 down on the table and said, I want to buy half your company. And I said, okay, what, you know, he said, I don't have a company except this Infinitizer thing, which wasn't doing too well. And he said, no, we're going to make those phono boxes. And here's half of it, you know, will you sell me 50% of this company? And I said, who the hell's going to buy these little boxes? And he said, there are people called audiophiles. I thought, okay, that sounds good. So I took his money, and that's how PS Audio started. And the very first products we made, it took us about a year to actually make one, as Dan pointed out. It's one thing to make a little box. It's another thing to actually turn it into a product. And Stan and I personally, we drew the PC boards out. We etched them ourselves in ferric chloride. We drilled every hole. We bent the metal. We silk screened the panels, cut the little walnut end blocks, and we started building it. And it had taken an ad out in a magazine back then called Audio Magazine. Gene Pitts was the editor, and took an ad out, 1/6 of a page, and it said $59.95. Take this home, and if you don't like it, we'll give you your money back. And I think it might have been the first, you know, take it home and try it, money back guarantee. And we sold 3,000 or 4,000 of those. Just checks for $59.95 started coming in the door, and that's how we started PS Audio.
Well, mine's a little simpler than that. Our family was always into music, and being newly married back at 75, 76, wanted a nice stereo, and it just wasn't in the budget, so I decided to build it. I never intended for it to become my lifelong work, and we went through all this live versus experimentation and everything, and just building this thing for my own use. And there was an ad on the radio about somebody opening up a high-end store in Visalia, about 20 miles away. High-end? What's high-end? Went over there, talked to him. And I was every retailer's nightmare. I told him, I says, well, you know, their names were Paul and Stan. Paul and Nevin. And sorry about that. But anyway, So I went in there and said, hey, you know, I kind of built some of my own speakers and everything. Would you like to hear them? And they were gracious enough to listen to them. And they said, well, you know, you've got something here really unique. Let's take it to Chicago. So I took time off from work, and we took an old Ford van and drove all the way to Chicago, Pitt Congress, I think it was, and was building these things in my garage, because that's where my shop was. And we came back from Chicago with about 17 dealers and orders for a couple of hundred pair. Had no idea how we were going to make them. But anyway, that was the beginning of Vandersteen Audio.
I like the story when the dealer said, are you going to take this to CES? And you said, what CES?
It's a similar chord.
And in the first volume of the Illustrated History, we have photographs of Vandersteen Model 2s being built with washing machines in the background in the garage. And there's a photo of Richard loading the first Model 2, first production model, into the back of his Pinto. That you would turbocharge yourself.
Part protection from the gas tank.
So, morning. My story starts really before university, because when I went to college, I always loved music. Music was very important to me. I sang, I played instruments. I was not sure how I was going to have music when I went to college, so I decided I needed a system, and I designed a tape recorder, a reel-to-reel tape machine, designed all the electronics, designed the electronics, put the whole thing together, and that was the first thing I designed, actually, and it really turned out very well. I had to learn how to do all the different parts of the tape recorder, the recording amplifier, the arrays amp, all these different things. Worked very well. Designed the speakers, took it with me, but I'd always known, I mean, even at that stage, that I wanted to design audio equipment because music was so important and wanted to enjoy it. Actually, that tape recorder was described in an article in Wireless World in 1971, which sort of dates it a bit. When I graduated, I worked very briefly for Marconi, and then I was asked to go and work for a company that was just starting up, a company called Lexon Audio, which some of you may remember. I can see at least one person in the audience who will remember the Lexon Audio amplifier. And I designed the electronics, and it was actually when I met Alan Boothroyd. And we did this working for a group who'd actually come out of Cambridge Audio, one of the first companies that took industrial design seriously. So at Lexon, we designed a preamp and a power amp and a speaker. And soon after that, Alan and I decided that we would start our own consultancy business, because we were interested in design, and he did some really cool stuff like the BBC microcomputer and the first calculator. It's hard to imagine, but back then there wasn't such a thing as a calculator. After about a year of this, I got really bored, because a lot of the people we were called in to design audio for were really quite flaky. And so I turned to Alan one day and I said, why don't we just have our own flaky audio company? And so we decided to do it, and that's where Meridian started. It started with the M1 loudspeaker and the 101 preamplifier, and that was 1977.
And that first loudspeaker was a powered loudspeaker.
Indeed it was.
And to this day, you still make powered loudspeakers.
Only powered loudspeakers, yeah. It was an active, three-way active system. We took it to some of the shows. I remember taking it to Milan to the Italian show when it was very new. We played it, and it played like 3 times louder than everything else, and people just loved the sound of it. Yeah, and it was like that story. We kind of got more orders than we knew what to do with. Actually, I have an answer for your CES, because at Lexon, I had to go to Chicago to CES. I didn't know what it was either. It was quite a surprise. Suddenly we learned what Teamsters were, and what isn't anybody going to close me meant? Things like that. For a naive Brit, that was kind of fun. Anyway.
I have one more question before we open it up.
Yeah.
In most engineering disciplines, they teach you that to design a product to be just good enough to work, and anything over that is overkill and a waste. But in high-end audio, there doesn't seem to be that. what defines high-end audio is that there is no limit until we get to the point where reproduced music is indistinguishable from live music. So what is it about the high-end designer that's different from conventional engineering or regular designers that they teach you in engineering school? Why are all of you so different from most engineers?
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay. Not being prepared to compromise, I think, is the thing. I mean, the idea of making it only just good enough is not at all interesting when we're talking about music reproducing equipment. I mean, obviously, you have to sell it at a profit, but to make it right, you have to keep working at it. You have to keep working at it. You have to keep trying things. You have to sometimes put more material in than logic would dictate. You know, there's a reason that a piano is as heavy as it is, and a loudspeaker that weighs nothing is a very, very, on very tricky ground. So, yeah, I think that's the thing. Don't compromise. That's been the way I've viewed it all the way along.
Well, in general, we live in a world that is about mediocrity. For most people, good enough is good enough for everybody. There are exceptions in the automotive world, cameras, in just about anything. And the most interesting part as a designer of the world market is where you are pushing the envelope and you are listening to individual components and you're trying to realizing all along that you're designing a product for a niche part of the market, a much smaller part of the market. But that's where the challenge is, and that's where you go outside of the box and you try things. Sometimes they don't make sense and they don't work. Sometimes they don't make sense and they do work. And in the end, it's how it delivers music to those few who care to do it better than what most people want. And that explains the broad variety of audio products that we have in the world. Most of it is good enough, and for those folks, it really is. A lot of what we do up here is pushing the envelope beyond. I've raced different kinds of cars and boats all my life, airplanes, and the one thing you learn when you get into the racing business, I don't know how many people here have attempted to do that, but to shave that last second or that last tenth of a second is a logarithmic number when it comes to money. And that's kind of about what goes on in our industry too, at least the way I see it.
I guess I'm pretty much the same. When I started out building synthesizers, I didn't want to just make another synthesizer that was just, and I've never, it's a really great question because I actually have never really thought about that. But I had no interest in making something that somebody else had already done. I love to cook. My whole family loves to cook, and every year we have a cooking contest called the McGowan Annual Heisman. And everybody attempts to outdo everybody else in the family, and the loser gets to do all the dishes. And I think it just kind of runs, it certainly runs in my blood. If I'm going to make a synthesizer, it's going to blow everybody away and be the best I can possibly do. If I'm going to make an amplifier, I just set the bar kind of high, because that's really, for me, that's all I'm really interested in. And it doesn't apply to everything in my life, but everything that excites me as a designer, as an engineer, finding something new, discovering a new way to get a circuit to come to an expectation without doing it the same way that has results that I wasn't happy with. I think all of that kind of plays into it, at least for me.
Well, at a very young age, I was very lucky. I was able to, able to attend a lot of orchestral concerts. I'm talking about even when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. And I had that sound emblazoned in my head for so many years. And of course, I love music. And at one point, I tried to take existing components, audio components, and put them together and see if I could get some reasonable facsimile of what I hear at an orchestral concert or a jazz concert. And to me, it all failed. So I thought, well, maybe now that I was working at Litton Industries, I had a lot of resources there. I had a very talented electronics partner, and I thought that we could take each of these kinds of speakers apart and make each of the components better. For example, we made one of the first working servo woofers. Woofers are very, very difficult to control under the best circumstances. When you servo them, you make them substantially better than if they're open loop or, just put in a box with a hole in the box or a sealed box. And the servo woofer worked out incredibly well because, as I mentioned earlier, I had a 4/3 Klipschorn. That was considered an incredible bass system. The regular Klipschorn had a 12-inch woofer. I made one a third larger with a 15-inch woofer, and that was the best bass I had ever heard, but I wasn't satisfied with it. And I thought, well, when we make this servo woofer, if it really is as we think it might be, equal to or better than that 4/3 Klipsch woofer, at least we've started out on the right foot. Well, not only did it, it just eclipsed so badly the 4/3 Klipsch woofer that we knew we had something. And then, of course, being a perfectionist in too many things, people have called me that for many years, had to make a better mid-range with electrostatic panels. Those were the best transducers that we knew about at the time, so we designed some mid-range electrostatic transducers. We felt that existing electrostatics had a couple major problems. One is they used square plates, and at the high frequency that beamed at you. So what we did is we just made a narrow strip that went down the entire length of the speaker. And we used the electronic crossover, and of course the servo bass system had to have its own servo amplifier. We had to have it some kind of transducer on the woofer so we could get that signal, feed it back to the input of the amplifier, and correct for the bad distortions that woofers always display. So it is the drive to make things better, especially in audio. And my friends tell me that maybe I should lose a little bit of that, but I still have that drive, and I still design speakers and other things. And I try to make them sound more like, when I go to live music, which I do often, more like that.
I guess for me, it's the fascination for creating something that's unique and different and hasn't been done before in audio. When I designed an amplifier like the Momentum amplifier, I designed a unique circuit, and for me the chase is to make the circuit work. And once that works, then the fascination for me is how much can I get out of it? How far can I push it? How much do I need from it to make it sound good? So how far can I push it? I push my circuits to the very edge where they become unreliable, and then back off to the point where they sound the best. And I think a lot of engineers, it's just normal engineering to see when you design something different where its limitations are, whether you reduce its performance or enhance its performance. You have to find that one part in the middle of how it operates to make it sound good. And I think that's been my quest on any of the circuits that I designed. And I always do the same thing. I get something unique to work, and then I push it and push it and push it until it becomes a product for me. So my fascination is the pursuit of making something unique and different, and something that sounds exemplary and different than what's already out there.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. This gentleman.
Who were your mentors? Were and are your mentors? Good question. That got you going, or you must have had, somebody that you...
Well, a book by Olson, a book by Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. I mean, that was in the early days. Those were my mentors because that's where I learned audio. See, I was initially trained in nuclear physics and then went to laser physics, and I had to learn audio because that was really what my passion was. And it was mostly from books, not, there was nobody teaching it at that time.
I think for me, it was the fascination of music reproduction in general. I mean, my family always listened to music. They listened constantly. There was always something on. I lived with my grandparents. They played music all the time. My parents played music. My uncles, my aunts, wherever you went, they were playing music. And, you know, mostly it was big band stuff and kind of that jazz from the 50s era. And I really got the bug for it. I mean, I when I was young and everybody was listening to rock and roll, you know, I was listening to jazz, you know, because I grew up on it. And that the reproduction of that stuff, I mean, you get a really good thing that you heard past when you lived with your parents, your grandparents, and you listen to that music. It brings tears to your eyes. It's emotional. It's a wonderful thing to do, and it's a hobby and a passion that doesn't hurt anybody. It makes people happy. So that's kind of what gets me going in music and got me in the business.
I think for me it was, you know, I really wasn't aware of high-end audio, wasn't aware in a small little town, raised in a family of very modest means, was not aware of this world going on. So, but from a little kid was always thinking outside the box, trying to discover new ways of doing things. And, you know, if there was a mentor, I have a lot of friends in this industry, and a lot of customers over the years. And those friends and those customers will never know how much of an impact they've had on what has been going on at Vandersteen Audio, what's going on at Vandersteen Audio, and what will be going on. Because that constant input, that constant desire to provide something that gives people joy, and the feedback that you get, that I've always just built on that. And so I would, if I have a mentor, it would be those people that have been on this journey with me through these now 1 year short of 40 years. So
it's a very, very good question that you're asking, because I think for me there are several mentors at different times in life. But as I said earlier, I always wanted to design audio equipment, and one of the strange things about high-end audio, about high-performance audio, is there really isn't a book about it, and we end up having to mix engineering with acute listening and intuition and repeating the experiment again and again and again. And so there were not many people to learn that from. But for me, the people who kept me on the rails, if you like, or helped me as I was growing up, there was a great analog theorist in the UK called Marcus Scroggie. I don't know if any of you ever read the books of Cathode Ray, those sort of descriptions. Then people like Peter Walker of Quad, I knew him very well, and he once called me into his office, said, when I was at Lexon, we'd had a review that said our amplifier sounded amazing. He said, Stuart, come here. All amplifiers sound the same. You know, that sort of thing. So it's good when you have to be challenged by people like that. Peter Baxendale, another great guy who I knew, and he kept trying to trick me in listening tests but could never do it. But they were very helpful. And then later, as I got into business, learning how to do business, Raymond Cook of KEF was a very great helper. And I guess the next one who was really significant that I'd mention is Baik Suzuki in Japan, who taught me how to navigate the politics of standards bodies, which has nothing to do with audio, but it's another life skill that you really need to have. Yeah. So anyway, that's my simple answer.
Well, I've had a number of mentors, and I'll make them real quick. The first one I ever had was in Germany, and his name was Rudi Strobel. And he taught me electronics, and if he had had a ruler, he would have hit me on a regular basis. He was one of these guys I had to learn the everything about the basics, how resistors worked and all of that stuff. So he taught me for a couple of years and kind of gave me my background in it. And I've had a number of them, but perhaps one of the most influential is this man right here. Arnie's taught me more about listening and music and high-end audio than any person on the planet. So.
Oh, thank you, Paul.
Well, I'm teacher, I dealt with hundreds of high school kids. As a teacher, I deal with hundreds of high school kids throughout my career. And I look at them because I see their blank faces when I talk about audiophile and what they're missing, and they think their earbuds and their beats and all that are the top of the mountain. Guys, as scions of the industry, how do you folks think we should expand this idea of, you know what I'm saying?
You know, you've got a very tough job. You've got a very tough job today. It seems like a lot of the younger generation, would rather put 100,000 songs, in their machine and then put the earbuds on and then make them go at random. I think one of the big problems is that particularly our country has stopped funding music in the high schools and junior high schools and grammar schools. When I went to school, a music class was mandatory, and certainly a lot of people got a lot of joy. I remember in junior high school, the entire class was taken over. The entire class. Gotta stop doing this. The entire class was taken to see the opera Tosca, and I know that made a huge impression on everybody there. Not that everybody came out loving opera, but at least they were exposed to some of the basics of music, and through their education, through the educational system, they were able to even gain more love and understanding of music. There's virtually none today, and you know it better than I.
I'm worried that they don't know what they're missing in terms of
They
audiophile
don't.
quality.
That's right.
Well, I would give a little different perspective on that. Well, I think you're right, and I think Arnie's right that the lack of funding for the arts in general, not just music, but art in general, is really, really sad in our country. But most of the kids I see today are so much more into music than when we grew up. They've got the earbuds on. My sons are all into vinyl. They love music. They listen to it constantly. And it's not just, I remember when one of my sons came to me at once, and of course I was running PS Audio at the time, and he said, "Hey, Pop, have you ever seen one of these things?" And he was holding an album. He said, "This is the coolest thing in the world. It's like plastic and a thing scrapes, and it's awesome." And I had to laugh, But I think music today is a big, big part, if not bigger part, of people's lives, of young people's lives. And I think the challenge is for us to reach out to them with products, with information, with education. I do seminars at a local place called the School of Mines. I was going to say in my home state, but Christ, we're already here, aren't we?
Yep.
Well, anyway, so for those guys in Colorado, you know where the School of Mines are. And I talk with these kids about it. And my son Scott has created a product called Sprout. And it's a little integrated amplifier for $500. It does everything, and that was made to reach out to the younger people. And so I think we can make a difference. But if there was any way this country would be agreeable to funding more in terms of art and music, that would go a long way as well.
Well, I have a comment about that. I mean, you're an actual teacher of music. I mean, what do you do exactly? I know you try to pound it in their heads that this is great, but beyond that.
Well, I'm actually not a music teacher, but I teach gifted children. Mm-hmm. And what I see as an observer of high school kids and the culture thereof, you're right, they are very much into music, and a lot of niche music too that's out there in their domain. But what they don't understand is this good enough factor. They don't understand what music properly reproduced truly sounds like, and therefore appreciate it.
Yeah, I believe
and
that.
There's a big gap, I think, Richard, on that one too.
I believe that that's always been the case. You have that in wine, you have that in cars. And then some people pick one area in their life where they want to push the envelope, where it really becomes a passion. Being good enough is not, I didn't mean to imply that was an inferior thing. It's, none of us can push the envelope in all walks of our life, unless you were incredibly wealthy, that you can bring people to understand that there is better sound, higher resolution, whatever you want to call it. You can bring that to people, but as I learned after a class reunion where 30 people came over, out of those 30, possibly one, they all kind of heard it, they all thought it was kind of neat and interesting, but only one, and this was after a big 2-page article in the local newspaper about our company and where it came from and export and all that. So it was kind of a hot number at that thing, and they wanted to, I said, well, come on over and we'll play with this stuff. So I think my wife said 33 people came over, and there might have been one that would entertain spending maybe $10,000 on it. So, but that's not new. That's always been the case. It's been that way in racing. It's been that way in watches. It's the desire to push beyond the norm has always been that small part on the top of a pyramid. The neat thing about the kids getting into music as much as they are now is that pyramid is getting larger, and when that pyramid gets larger, that little part on the top will also grow. And that's the encouragement for the future, the way I see it.
I think that MP3 didn't help matters.
No, it didn't. I was about to bring that up, actually. I think one of the issues we have is a generation who's been acclimatized to thinking that reproduced music sounds like MP3. And that's a major problem. Now, the really good news is that most of the time these kids get out a bit and they actually know what the real world sounds like. But it's the gap between live music and reproduced music. But I mean, I'm not being frivolous when I talk about the environment. One of the things maybe you should do with these people is do listening skill tests on birdsong. Play them birdsong. What can they recognize? When they start to think that they can actually use their hearing, everyone's got great hearing. Use your hearing to identify things and listen more clearly. I find, I have kids, they bring their friends home, all they've ever listened to is like 1-inch speakers with an iPhone. You play them a real system, they're completely astonished. And what's even more interesting is that they never knew it could happen. They live at home with their little kitchen radios and these things, and they think reproduced music, radio is one thing, and then the real world is something else. And that's the gap that is not even thought about. Don't even realize that it exists. We get excitement from it because the more it sounds like the real thing, the more communication there is, the more you understand the music, the more exciting it is. But
I think, Bob, I agree with you. Yeah. And one of the things that music class did when I was in high school, you were exposed to really good hi-fi. I mean, first of all, I walked in the class, and I took it because I wanted to get a credit, and music was cool. So I went in there, and here's this guy playing a Reco Cut turntable and L-Tech A700s and a Macintosh amplifier, and he's playing, and you're looking at the stuff playing, and you're listening to the music, and you're going, wow, this stuff is really off the chart. You love it. And then everybody in the room was like, even the girls were mesmerized by the fact that this equipment was there. They would look at it and they go, wow, well, the 60s girls, they weren't into that stuff, But really, I mean, it's like an...
different girls, I guess.
Okay. Mine had different ideas. But still, you're mesmerized by the music, first of all, which was all classical music. And secondly, the fact that it could be reproduced in a relatively large room and sound so nice, and the equipment was kind of really high-techy for the time.
But then that's exactly right. Exposure. They get exposure. They had exposure in our days.
Yeah.
I mean, and some of them were forced to have that exposure, but there is very little exposure to that kind of a thing today. Certainly not in the junior high schools or high schools. I mean, maybe on one hand you could count, certain schools that would do that, but there's no funding for it anymore. I mean, there's really no funding for physical education. And you're right, it's all the arts that have really taken a tremendous hit. And that is part of the entire problem, I believe.
Well, having been a music teacher and having to give it up because I couldn't afford to continue being one,
Yeah.
there's nothing more real than the real instrument right in front of you. And if you've never heard that or you've never experienced that, I mean, 100 years ago, if you wanted to hear music, you had to play it yourself. Or you had to go listen to someone else. And so everybody knew that. And then in order to make money, they kept finding cheaper and cheaper ways of selling more and more and more, which I think is really the crime of the whole thing, is the masses making more money at the expense of great sounding music. I mean, CDs just, everything kept going down, and they don't know anything but CD, and they think CD sounds great because, well, that's all they've ever heard. How could they think anything could be better if they've never heard anything better?
It's worse than that. It's MP3s.
Well, yeah, no, it did. It kept going down and down.
Well, Scott, that's really interesting. You should say that because I was talking about kids listening to these small speakers and their iPods. And I saw this in kids that were playing real instruments, playing violins, cellos, in string quartets, in orchestra. They'd go to orchestra, they'd play, and then they'd come back and listen to a completely different genre on the iPod and not even realize there was a gap. Because it never occurred to them that great sound of the instruments right in front of them could be reproduced.
Right. Well, that's what a recording sounds like.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, that's a recording, and this is real. And
well, that's what they thought a recording was like. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
There's a chart in some of the MQA documents showing convenience versus quality. So you see convenience go like this, and you see quality go like this.
I have to say that's the most controversial chart we ever produced. So everyone argues about every data point.
Firstly, I am honored to be in the same room with all of you. It truly is. This is awesome. Including you, Mr. Harley. I mean, I've read your stuff for years. Yes. A couple of years ago, I did a seminar in this very room on similar topics. Okay, you can check it out on YouTube if you like, whatever. This time I just decided to take it easy with my wife, and we have a small hobby business, I call it. I've been doing it for about 17 years, and we do home AV and audio systems. And I refuse to do stuff that I know is not going to sound right. People say, well, I want music all over the house, or whatever. Okay, call this guy. Or, I want to put the speakers up at the corners. Really? Well, that's where they ran the wires. So I'd sit down and say, look, you know what? I'm not an architect. I don't build houses. I don't tell people where to put studs and joists and things like that, and they shouldn't tell us where to put the speakers. So if you want to do it right, this is how I'll do it. Otherwise, call this guy. He'll stick them wherever you want him. Because it's not my real job, I could do that. Now, I don't do super high-end expensive stuff like Mr. Vandersteen does, although your Vandersteen 5s were the very first loudspeakers when I first started in this business that totally blew me away, that truly, without distortion, rocked the floor in the little audio store where I heard them. That was really an event. I don't know if my wife even remembers it, but it was about 20 plus years ago. Awesome. So, point I'm getting to is one at a time. We have to demo, and we have to keep the price reasonable. We can't tell them, well, these loudspeakers cost $10,000. We got to get them away from their iHome Bluetooth audio stuff and explain briefly why that doesn't work so well, or pairing this in the car through Bluetooth audio, not counting aptics. Okay, aptics is okay, but most of these devices aren't compatible, and show them what happens when you just merely plug it in, or when you go to a reasonable system. I had this happen just recently to me. We're at some friend's house. One of the guys there knew I was into audio, and their son, who really rarely talks to anyone, he just, as far as adults, he's kind of geeky, nerdy, just started university this fall. And this was in the summer. He said, hey, my friends gave me a turntable for my birthday. And I said, well, describe it. He says, it's a project. I said, what is it, a Project Debut Carbon? He said, yes. I said, that's an awesome table. Have you hooked it up? He said, no, I don't have anything to hook it up for. I said, come over to my house next Saturday. So he and his dad came over, and I played him some vinyl and did a few things. And he turned to me, and he said, I had no idea music could sound like this. That's what he said. And my systems are fairly modest, so I went downstairs. I had an old pair of Klipsch bookshelf speakers that were gathering dust. I said, take these home. He said, okay. I had an old Sherwood receiver big thing, and I said, take this with you so you'll have something into which to plug it in. The guy has turned into this super audiophile. He texts me now. That's how we communicate. By the way, that's how you communicate with these folks. This, okay. That's why he texts me a lot. It's one at a time, guys. You have the right idea, but we just got to keep it going.
I wrote an editorial once called 10 Minutes in the Sweet Spot, whose argument was if we could get 10 minutes in front of a system for anybody, a fair percentage of them would want to have that experience again.
A demo's worth 1,000 words.
I think we have time for one more.
Each of you up there have made the point of making your start as by yourself and about one other partner, and then growing up from there. At what point does just running and administering your company start to interfere with the kind of designs that you really like to do? I think that's why you mentioned the fact that, well, good enough seems good enough for most people, and that's the way they operate, because what they're looking at doing is they say, how many units can we make and how much money can we get out of them? And you've got the better approach, I think, to come up and say, how good can we make what we do? And I prefer it to see that way, but I'm just wondering, have you ever got to the point where you were hampered in doing that just because of the size of the company, the people you have to deal with, and just running it in general?
As the company gets larger, inevitably that will happen, and you have to, beware of that and try to understand that you have to delegate, you have to find competent people, or else you're going to be stuck in that niche you're talking about.
Yeah.
Dan, you have an interesting take on that question.
Well, my take on it is really simple. Those kind of constraints and those kind of things that are distracting to a designer has happened from day one, because you have to procure materials, you have to pay for them, you have to build and design things, and at the same time the telephone rings, you have to answer it. There's a huge amount of annoyances when you start your own business that drag you away from the actual essence of what you want to do. And as Arnie puts it, it just keeps on multiplying in a logarithmic way as you add employees, add products, and add services, and then you get distracted constantly.
Well, I'm fortunate. What I did is, the first thing I did is paid the kids more money than they could get anywhere else, so they keep the grandkids close to grandma, and grandma's happy, grandpa's happy. And then made them all partners, and they deal with all of that for me, and I don't have to mess with it anymore.
But the point is, somebody's got to do it. Right?
Yeah, but it's not the designer.
Yeah, exactly.
The same thing happens to audio writers who become magazine editors.
And I would say learning business was probably the single hardest thing I had to do. It took, I came so close to bankruptcy so many times, it became kind of a way of life. I became very good as a fireman. We used to, and just daily putting out fires. This, can't make payroll, can't do this. And I finally found a business mentor who taught me a lot. The difference between profit and cash, all kinds of good stuff. Things I never really wanted to learn, but, when you're in business for yourself, it's learn or die. So, and I think all of us in this table have been through a lot to get to this point.
And you're all still here.
And we're all still here.
All right, well, we're out of time. I'd like to thank these great designers for being on the panel here.